You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your hosts, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management. Welcome back to Habitat University. We are continuing our exploration of private lands, wildlife conservation, and we're going to stick with a theme we started last episode, and we're going to stick to federal agencies and how they work on private land to get conservation work done. So we're going to switch from NRCS and all of their alphabet soup of programs and talk about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their Partners program, where they partner with private landowners to do habitat and wildlife conservation work on private lands. So, Adam, this week was yours. You had the honor of doing the interview. So, can you tell us a little bit about who your guests were and what you covered?
Yeah, it was a really fun interview. I think I say at one point in the cut that I have more questions in this interview than I think I've ever had. I just went into this interview like really naive, and Gwen Kolb from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in New Mexico and Kraig McPeek from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stationed in Illinois, but with regional multi-state responsibilities, took all my dumb questions in stride. And I learned a ton in this episode. So this one was a lot of fun. We did talk about the Partners program a fair bit, but then the other thing we talked about was just like the role of the federal government in wildlife management when it comes to endangered species under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And as you'll hear in the episode, I had some, like I said, some kind of dumb questions from my upbringing and just being sort of sheltered in what the reality of the Endangered Species Act and its significance on private lands were. And I would humbly like to think that some of the listeners will have those questions too. And hopefully they won't think my questions were too dumb and they'll get something out of the discussion that we had.
Yeah, I'm excited to listen to it as well, because it seems like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's private lands program are less well understood than a lot of the Farm Bill programs like CRP and the litany of programs like that. And I think most of the time at least when I think of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I think of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a migratory waterfowl, setting regulations, but also working on refuges. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to hear more about their Partners program and their work on private land.
Yeah, you're going to get that. Gwen told me at one point, I don't remember the exact number, but in the neighborhood of like 250 private lands wildlife biologists in the country with the agency. But then, Kraig thinks and works a lot adjacent to and on private lands as well for the ecological services work. And there's, hundreds more, I presume, in that branch. So yeah, there's a lot of people out there and they have some really cool programs. Some people, say it's like one of the best kept secrets for private landowners interested in doing habitat management on their property. And so hopefully after the folks listen to this episode, they're going to come away with some ideas and maybe reach out to their own partners, biologists in their own state, and start a conversation about how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service may be able to help landowners or managers achieve some of their own goals for their property.
Well, with that, we'll get to the episode.
Gwen and Kraig, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast and learn from you about your work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other things. So first, welcome to Habitat University. And I'd love to hear a little bit about you, just sort of an introduction. So Gwen, if you'd like to go first, tell us who you are and what you do and how you got there.
Hello, my name is Gwen Kolb. I'm presently the state coordinator for the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program in New Mexico. I'm stationed in Albuquerque. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I worked about 14 years in Illinois doing Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and I was the state coordinator there for the last 6 years before I came over to New Mexico in 2016. I'm pretty private land oriented. I've been in the Partners program my whole career, so this is my 24th year. I don't see doing anything else because that's, I think, is the way we're going to be going in the future. It's going to be the private landowners, their lands, and us working with them to address some of the issues, the monstrous issues that are coming down the pike for all of us. So I don't know what else you need from me, Adam.
That's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I'm going to ask you a million more questions about your thinking on those topics, and really excited to have your perspectives on the show. So, Kraig, how about you? What's your title and what do you do at the Fish and Wildlife Service?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. And it's great to be on here with Gwen, longtime colleague. She's got me for, sounds like three years longer than me, Gwen. I got 21, maybe 22 years with the agency. And so, Adam, currently I'm the supervisor at what we call the Illinois and Iowa Ecological Services Field Office. What that basically means is, we serve much more regulatory function under the Endangered Species Act. And so we work both with public and private landowners on potential impacts to endangered species, but also recovery and habitat conservation for them. And so, yeah, that's what I do currently. I've spent, of those 20 some years in the Fish and Wildlife Service, about half of them, about 10 years, probably closer to 12, was in the private lands program, similar to, or same as Gwen. Spent some time running around Iowa and Illinois delivering habitat on private land, and then spent some time in Ohio as the state coordinator for the program. But really the roots for me go back to dairy farming in Northwest Illinois. Grew up on a small dairy farm. And I tell people every day, I try to implement the same common sense that you had to implement on a dairy farm in our government job. And it's going to make me mad doing it, but I try every single day. And so in a nutshell, that's me.
You each kind of bring a different perspective. I think the nature of your positions is that you would, if you were in the same state, you would collaborate with one another, the Ecological Services Office and the Partners group. Okay, so nodding your heads in agreement.
So,
are there such entities in every state and territory, or could you tell us a little more about sort of the system of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service involvement in private lands work across the country?
It's an interesting question, Adam, because the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, we're the only group in the Department of Interior with the authority to work with strictly private landowners. I don't work on public or state lands. So we're an interesting group. There's only about 240 of us across the United States and our islands and the like. So we're really dedicated, small group, but we're pretty much the delivery mechanism for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So That's a little bit about the Partners program. And we've been on the ground only since 1987. So young program too. So.
Okay, great. So I think that maybe some of our listeners will be curious what the difference between like the Partners program and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and like the state wildlife resource agency. Like here in Iowa, it would be like the Iowa DNR, or well, in New Mexico, is it New Game and Fish, or?
Yes, it's New Mexico Game and Fish. Yes.
Yeah. So what is the difference between the two entities?
I'll take a shot, Gwen.
Yeah.
And because coming from a farm, having family that still farms, we get that question a lot. And I can boil it down very simplistically to, if it resides, being the resource, predominantly in a state boundary. So white-tailed deer, wild turkey, squirrels, they have state jurisdiction. So the state has authority to manage those resources. If it, like waterfowl, flies across state boundaries and multiple state boundaries, the federal government actually has jurisdiction on setting harvest limits and sort of being the primary conservation goal setting agency. And so, that's really, and if you really boil it down, that's the difference, is that the state DNRs have authority for state resources, state trust resources, whereas the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have jurisdiction and authority on federal trust, federally endangered, federally threatened, and large migratory species.
So the federal trust species, then that's what those 240 partners biologists are trying to figure out, like how we can do habitat conservation on private lands for those federal trust species, namely endangered species and then the migratory birds. Gwen?
Well, I mean, federal trust species are all species, okay? Endangered and those migratory critters are part of our suite. So I also keep common species common because I work with the game and fish folks. So if they've got species of concern, I'm right there with them. It's about habitat. You get the habitat on the ground and all these species, including the humans, benefit. So a little bit different than what you're thinking, okay? A federal trust species to me, if it walks, moves, flies, crawls, snails, whatever, I've got it. I'm near for it. So if it's got a special title, then it's even, okay, that's even better. That gets more money. But for the most part, it's about habitat and, whatever my private landowner is willing to take on to improve that habitat for federal trust species. That's in our mission statement for the Partners Program.
Okay, cool. So could you give us an example of some of these species that you spend a lot of time working on or managing for down in New Mexico?
Well, I've got the migration corridors, so I'm working with elk now and antelope and those are not endangered species.
Right, yeah.
But they're moving across. They're moving. They're migrating. So like I said, anything that's moving, we can be involved with. We've got a lot of endangered species, our riparian areas, because I'm desert scape. So our riparian areas cover migratory birds coming through. We've got, the endangered species of those that deal in these riparian areas and our bosques, which is cottonwood galleries. So, so it's whatever is a big priority. Me and the state, we're working together and our landowners' interests. I mean, I've got landowners that don't care for the elk because they can do a lot of damage. And then we got landowners that outfit for elk. So you've got to balance all of those things coming through, especially when there's federal funding for migration corridors, because we're trying to improve the herds so they can migrate through to wherever they need to go to. I mean, I'm working with mountain goats and things like that. It's whatever the state's priorities are, I'm right there with them. And then I can put a federal nexus on their lands and we can help protect even more. So I'm always looking landscape scale, big picture.
That's really interesting. I can't say that I would have anticipated, Gwen, that you were working on elk in the Southwest.
Oh, yeah.
That's really interesting, but I guess I hadn't thought about that migration connection.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, Kraig, why we find a lot of federal interest in things like bats in the Midwest, or what? Is that the same sort of root motivation?
Yeah, you absolutely. I mean, the bats in the Midwest, we have two bats that are federally protected. We have an endangered Indiana bat and then the threatened northern long-eared bat, both long distance migrating species. Certainly both interact with wind turbines, which gets a lot of press at times. But also when, to Gwen's point, when we work with private landowners, one of the things that we help them understand is that really good turkey habitat is also really good bat habitat. And so when you can find that bridge, when you find that thing that really motivates a landowner, and we're providing good turkey habitat, so their hunting experiences are optimized, but on the backside of that, we also have good bat habitat. So bats drive a lot of the forest recommendations and conservation that we implement throughout Illinois and Iowa. Absolutely.
I think that's really interesting about your approach, where you almost have like a really broad understanding of wildlife habitat needs so that you can sort of satisfy your federal trust obligations, like creating bat habitat, but make a compelling case to a landowner like turkey habitat or something like that. I think that must be a skill that is developed through a lot of practice. And so the Habitat University, we sort of created this whole podcast because we perceived there to be a lot of confusion on what is and isn't wildlife habitat for any given species or species group. And so I'm curious, in your experience working with private landowners across the United States, what are the most common maybe misconceptions or misunderstandings about habitat, and how do you talk to a private landowner about what makes good habitat for some species that they may be interested in?
My days in Illinois, there's a lot of duck hunters, lots of duck hunters. And, and a lot of folks had their misconceptions about duck hunters, but because it was, corn type oriented, because they knew that's what bring those ducks in. And I, methodically talk with each of these folks about the benefit of these natural foods, because the temperatures were already changing, so it would stay warmer longer. And to get to corn, you got to have frozen water and stuff knocked over. Okay. So I talked with them. I said, give me 20 acres over here and let's just have it natural. You mean leave all those weeds in there? I said, yes, leave all those weeds in there, because that's, a smart weed. It was all good duck food. So we put our little 20 acres in there, and all the ducks were hitting on that. And so the boys would get all their limits, and then they'd want to drain it out immediately because they felt that's what was necessary. And I said, well, let's leave that piece of water right there. Just let it stay. It's just thinking how it's going to affect them. I mean, the same thing with my farmers and my ranchers. How about their pocketbooks? If I'm doing good grasslands, right, and they're running cows and we do rotational grazing, we have grasslands for all my critters. We got the pliers, which are like prairie potholes. We fence those out, give them watering places so the cows won't get down in there. And we move those cows like the buffalo roamed. And so I've got all my grasslands back. My landowner's got his pocketbook taken care of. My duck hunters got their ducks, and everybody wins. Okay, so it's just thinking, your landowner he or she called me. And so I'm just going to provide them information about what they envision on their landscape. And that's how we get that process started. Okay, I'm not going to put a wetland on top of a mountain. How about that wet spot over there by that tree over there? Okay, maybe we put something over there and we put something else up on the mountain. Okay, so, but that's our expertise. And that's what we bring to the table with these landowners. It's just knowing the different things. I mean, I've got to know the soils. I've got to know the tree. I got to know the plants. I know the hydrology. I've got to know a lot of different things, socioeconomic things. I need to know language. I mean, so it's just, you listen to your landowner, you get your audience. If you listen to your landowner, and then you can go from there. It just boils down to that. You got to listen. Okay. They'll tell you what's going on. And they got more history than I do because I just stepped on their land.
I just add one thing to that, Adam, if I could. Similarly to the way Gwen explained that, I mean, you got to meet people where they are. And, to Gwen's point, if someone's really interested in waterfowl hunting, well, you don't want to go there and start talking about pheasants, right? Like, you meet them where they are. And then to your point, Adam, about, being skilled in communication. And rarely does it come down to a species. Well, I should take that back. A wildlife species. The species it comes down to is the humans, right? Can we communicate effectively and come up with a shared goal and objective that we can implement on the land? And I used to tell landowners when I did it, for a living, that land ownership is without a doubt a blessing and a gift, and you should be, you're blessed with that. But it is such a burden. It is such a burden because everybody wants you to do with your land what they want you to do with your land. And so until we can really identify what are your objectives, what are your goals, once we can get there, then the private lands program or fish and wildlife biologists or DNR biologists can begin to shape that and mold that to meet those objectives that also have ancillary benefits to the federal trust resource or the state trust resource.
Yeah, those are really interesting perspectives. And I think what you just did is you just gave us a clip for the whole reason we're doing this season focused on private lands. Those answers that you two just provided, because what the unique challenge is that wildlife are very rarely the first order priority for land management decisions in the way that they are on a national wildlife refuge or on a state game area or something like that. And that's definitely a concept that we set out to explore in this season. We were thinking we'd get to it actually later. And so I really appreciate you shining a light on that and saying essentially how central that is in the work that the Fish and Wildlife Service does in stewarding these trust resources on private lands that comprise the majority of the lands in the country, and in states like these Midwestern ones, the vast majority of the land. So that is really fascinating. A couple of questions and directions to take the conversation. One thing I'd like to explore in a fair bit of detail is endangered species on private lands. And I know you both touched this from kind of different angles. I think Kraig mostly kind of from a regulatory angle or perspectives in the ES office, and then Gwen with that sort of being a motivation for some of the work that you do through the Partners Program. And I'm curious what you think are common misconceptions or things that people really need to understand about federally endangered species that are found on private lands, and how you approach those in your work.
You want me to go first, Gwen?
Oh, yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I'd be happy to go first then. So first, let me just maybe clear up just a little bit there. I mean, certainly during the listing process, the primary motivation for the ecological services staff is a regulatory information gathering and regulatory, perspective. But once a species is listed, my philosophy and the philosophy of many of the ES offices, it's 100% about recovery. We have regulatory responsibilities that Congress gave us under the Endangered Species Act. Like, for example, Adam, if you had a farm or you own land and you knew there was an endangered species there, you knew it, you had this information. Mm-hmm. The law says you shouldn't do something to impact that endangered species without evaluating and consulting with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of landowners are, they are stewards. And so they wouldn't in any way do that. But a lot of times what happens is they don't know they're there. And then something happens, and then maybe they're concerned, they're maybe even scared, they're making decisions out of fear. And that, to me, is the bridge we need to build. You shouldn't be scared. We have tools in the Endangered Species Act to allow private landowners to sort of rid themselves of risk, which can break down that fear and allow us to make decisions that are recovery oriented, right? Because listing a species under the Endangered Species Act is by all accounts a failure. Like, if we've done that, we've got a species on our planet that we believe is in danger of extinction, we have failed, right? Because, a good friend of mine, Scotty Gritters on the river, would say, we don't why are endangered mussels important? And he would say, for all we know, the next protein that makes ice cream taste better is in that mussel. Why would we want it to go extinct? Right. So, and if you look at the medicinal purposes of plants and animals, I wouldn't think anybody would want them to go extinct, because we may need the next cancer or Alzheimer's drug may come from a protein from an endangered bee. Right. So to me, once they're listed, it's all about recovery, and we should be breaking down whatever concerns a landowner. And we have those tools. We being the Fish and Wildlife Service and the regulatory side, have to be better about articulating what those are.
Okay, so that's where I want to go. So I think the short answer to my question was people have some fears when it comes to endangered species. I think that's what I hear in your answer. And but it sounds like maybe those fears are often unfounded because of what you shared about intent. Is that right? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. Okay.
Yeah.
In this one, I wanted to disclose to you all, this is a unique podcast for me because I actually don't have the answers to the majority of the questions that I'm asking. So go along with me and take my stupid questions as just an indication of even my own naivete as it relates to the complicated nature of endangered species on private lands. And so what I guess I want to ask kind of two things. One, I want to ask Gwen, especially about the conversation you have at the farm gate or at the ranch gate that kind of builds on what Kraig just shared. Like, hi, I'm from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm here to help manage this endangered species on private lands. And we have tools. where does that conversation go from there? And then I want to kind of toggle back and forth on like what these specific tools are, and maybe even dig in on like the regulatory authority, or not regulatory authority, the authority granted you by Congress to use those tools in managing endangered species on private lands. But first, Gwen, tell me, you pull up to the gate, where do you start on the subject of endangered species?
I wouldn't.
Okay.
The
That's great
landowner
too.
called me there for a reason. Okay. He or she has something they envision on their land. When I get in, if we decide to go forward on that, whatever, if it's something that's within my authorities and reach to take care of that, and then I will do a section 7 on that land. And if we find endangered species or historically we're there, it's how I present to the landowner. Okay, well, there's a potential if we put this habitat back, this critter might come back. Or you've got the critter on, I say critter, I'm just going to say species, whatever you want to call it. You might have them here, and we need to get in here and check that out so we know how to go forward. But it's how you present it. If you present it with fear, because most people have this thing, if they've got endangered species on their land, you're going to take my land and tell me how to do my own, da, 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 da. So I don't give them a chance to bring that up. We'll just go forward. Okay, so you've got this riparian there, and I'm thinking to myself, Southwest willow flycatcher. I guarantee you this bugger's here because I've seen the critical habitat. So we want to do some clearing because we've got tamarisk. We have salt cedar that is sucking up, whatever, much more water than the natives would use because they all use water. And so I have to talk with my species lead about removing some of those things and what I'm going to put back in there. And I've got to let this landowner know that this critter is here. But there are CCAs, there's different things if they want protection, or if they're going to do anything ever again in that area. If I do my job right, we're going to get habitat back. And, I've got to watch it, because back in the old days on the other side of the Mississippi, I could plant a prairie and maybe have some response, maybe in 6 months. Over here, it might be 4 years. So I've had to change my thought process and my restoration also on this side. But that's not how I would start that conversation, because the landowner called me. This is a voluntary program. I'm not going to spook him right out the gate. We'll talk about endangered species. If they're there and the critical habitat's there, I just did a stream. We're putting beaver dam analogs in a area, and the New Mexico meadow jumping mouse is up above it and below it. But since it's so degraded, we're going to put these BDAs in, and I guarantee you the mouse is coming there. This landowner renamed this place the New Mexico Jumping Mouse Ranch. He's embracing it because how I presented it. He's proud of it. We're going to teach him how to monitor with the little tracks. It's tracks, right? He wants to monitor for the mouse. So it's how you present it. Okay. This guy, my office is ecstatic. We've got a landowner that wants endangered species, and he wants to monitor for this endangered species. But it's how I presented it to him, how it's a benefit. I wouldn't start with it like that because you're going to spook them, because all they have is the misconceptions. But this landowner will tell other landowners having endangered species on his property ain't bad. And that's how the word gets out.
That's a really cool story about that ranch, and your approach to that message about having endangered species could actually be a gift or a real enriching part of owning your property. And then I think it's also not lost on me that it's important to remember, at least as it relates to the partners program, that you're not showing up at the ranch door unsolicited. You're helping. You're an entity there to help. Yeah. Okay.
They call me.
That's great. So you said a acronym in there that was CCA. Could you tell us more about what a CCA is and how that's what that acronym even is, and how that's used on private lands?
Want me to take that, Gwen?
Go ahead, boss. That's your baby. I just get people to sign up for them.
Well, I'll be happy to add. So the CCA, and there's another one called CCAA, Candidate Conservation Agreement. or candidate conservation agreement with assurances. And so when I was talking earlier about we need to do a better job of articulating these tools to these landowners. So one of the tools we have is, we do have species that are found to be eligible for listing, but we're putting it off because of other higher priority activities, and they become candidates. And so they're on this list of candidates. If a landowner wants to do a project, maybe they already have some habitat, they just want to augment that habitat. This agreement allows them to do all of this conservation. And if the species does ultimately get listed as endangered or threatened, nothing more is going to be asked of you. You've done all of the things that could be done, and you're sort of in this agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so that's one of those tools. And then, of course, those assurances come with that. There's like this, helps take care of that fear that we were talking about, that, well, if this jumping mouse or whatever shows up, and then they're going to come in and they're going to manage all my pastures. Like, no, you've already done the things that you said you were going to do, and it's an agreement. It's a handshake. We're going to move on. The other thing that Gwen mentioned that I wanted to define also is Section 7. She said she comes in, she does Section 7. So under the Endangered Species Act, Section 7 is the part of the act that says federal agencies that are spending money or making decisions would consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service before they make those funding decisions or project decisions. Mm-hmm. It just makes sense, right? You wouldn't want to spend federal dollars doing something that's going to impact an endangered species without thinking about it fully. Mm-hmm. And so what Gwen's talking about there is when she goes to do a project, she has a form where it sort of helps her go through a sort of the decision matrix. Is this going to be fully beneficial? Is it going to impact the species in ways we haven't thought about? And so she's just checking that box that, yeah, this is a good use of federal resources at this place.
Mm-hmm.
So in our last episode, we learned about the alphabet soup of USDA programs.
Oh, they're way worse than us, Adam.
They are. It is. My head was spinning. Now, Brienne Lowe, who you may know from Indiana NRCS, did a really nice job of breaking down all the alphabet soup. But I'm curious, you all collaborate at some level, right? Like there are considerations for maybe Section 7, or there are these considerations in those federal programs as well, right? Even though you're in a totally different department.
Yeah. So to Gwen's point earlier, right? Federal trust resources, that's all of the federal agencies. And so, yeah, when a USDA biologist or program manager is making a decision, Section 7 dictates that they will have considered impacts to endangered species. And if they believe there's going to be an impact, they would formally consult with us to work through that.
That's right.
Interesting. So in that way, the Fish and Wildlife Service is like the ultimate authority on impacts to wildlife. But a landowner may day-to-day interact with a USDA like FSA or NRCS person that's in a local field office, maybe more routinely on issues of, say, endangered species.
Yeah, your listeners can't see my eyes sort of wandering because I'm just, the word authority grabbed my attention the way you used it there, Adam. I wouldn't say that we are the ultimate authority. What I would say is we are here to provide professional and technical support to the other federal agencies. Like, for example, Wildlife Services, they are the authority on, troublesome wildlife, right? So they may come to, they're the authority on that issue. They may say, well, what will this impact have if we were to use this technique? Well, we maybe will help them see sort of more clearly the other impacts of that action. So in that way, we're not the authority. I would say we're just sort of professional technical advisors.
Okay.
We're all responsible for the Endangered Species Act. So we're using federal funds. You best follow through because we're all responsible for it, sir.
Great. Thanks. That's a good distinction and clarification. Okay. So we established that the partners program is very, well, as the name implies, very partnership forward. It's the federal agency. And Gwen, I love that. You just gave me a big thumbs up. I kind of wish this was there was a visual aspect. I have to just interpret your enthusiastic.
Well, what I can say is we were partners before partnering wasn't cool. We've always partnered. Okay. I like to say that because we've always done it. Now you've seen a lot of other people want to come to the table. They want to, let's put all this together, So we've been partnering before partnering wasn't even cool. So
I love that.
Right?
Well, that's actually a perfect segue to another question that I had is, and I'd like to come back to some T&E stuff, but I want to kind of dig in on this partners thing a little bit more. Tell us some stories that you're proud of with the partners program. Like, tell us examples of some real successes that you're familiar with, maybe both of you, of the partners program making an impact in collaboration with private landowners and other agencies, and affecting these federal trust resources.
I'll have two that I'll share, Adam. And while I'm doing that, Gwen maybe can think of, she's got a list way longer, I'm sure of it. The first one that I'm thinking about is Northeast Ohio and working with some private landowners up there with Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. And I can remember a time, because I had an ecological services background before getting into the partners program. And of course, now I have a partners program or background before being a supervisor in the ecological services. I can remember so vividly sitting in a meeting with our regional director, asking me, why we would want to do this thing. It had to do with funding to landowners and a nonprofit in that area. And I just remember saying to him, this is a rattlesnake. It's already hard enough to get them to say yes. Let's not add to it, right? We need to make it easy to say yes versus easy to say no. And I think if that advice could, further get itself into recovery decisions in the ESA, and I think we'd be way better off for it. But ultimately, we were able to get that partnership up and running. A lot of really great habitat happened for the snake up there, and the population is doing great, last I heard. And then the other one, which I'm personally proud of, and many people in this office and across the state of Iowa are very proud of, is what we've done with Topeka shiners in north central Iowa. Not only because we were able to crack the code of what the species needed and also what landowners, what were driving certain decisions. We kind of cracked that code. We were able to make it easy to say yes. We were able to leverage USDA funds, make it fully, federally funded to create oxbows. But what came from the years after those initial days with some Alicia Kinney at this office and folks at the Iowa Hygienics Lab and elsewhere was using these oxbows to treat nitrogen and, strategically putting them on the landscape for fish benefit and waterfowl benefit, but as important, nitrogen reduction on runoff. And to me, that marriage of water quality that meets the objectives of our agricultural side with the endangered species, those are the stories we got to get out there, right? If we can be treating nitrogen and phosphorus with oxbow wetlands that also benefit endangered minnows, come on, that's just good.
I agree completely with that example of Topeka shiners. That's one that I'm familiar with working here in Iowa and working in the water quality agricultural realm that I do a lot of my education in. And just for the listeners that aren't familiar with the system, basically the situation there is this small minnow, I think they're a minnow, that was once common in low gradient prairie streams across sort of the northern Great Plains, like think Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa, was listed under the Endangered Species Act relatively early, I think, Kraig, right? Like they've been listed for a while. And then what Kraig mentioned, the reference to finding that they need oxbows, disconnected meanders of streams that were created historically through natural flooding, but also were created extensively in the Corn Belt through channelization to drain, make rivers and streams move faster. They found that those fish were reproducing in those oxbows. And yeah, the Fish and Wildlife Service has really emerged as a leader in getting landowners to find these areas on their farms, reimagine their uses, because they're already marginal. You're not farming corn in an old stream channel with rare, that some people try, but most people aren't. They recognize them as marginal. And then here's a place that we've already sort of identified as sort of a marginal area on the farm, and we can get these endangered species benefits. But wait, there's more in there. And then that's what you said about the denitrification, which is a huge issue. It's on, in the opinion section of the Des Moines Register, the big newspaper here in Iowa, I think at least once a month, debates about water quality and its intersections with agriculture. So here again, you all have taken this discussion in a direction we plan to go this season, which is like a lot of times to get wildlife conservation done on private lands, we need to all get on board with multiple objectives, meet the landowners where they are, and align multiple disparate priorities, which in this case is endangered species and water quality. So you struck a chord with me there, Kraig, with the Topeka Shiner example. Even though I'm far from a fish biologist, I really admire what the Fish and Wildlife Service and partners, everybody from the Nature Conservancy to the Iowa Soybean Association and everybody in between lined up behind this really small fish.
That's right.
In these low gradient streams. So that's a cool example.
Well, before we pass it over to Gwen, I just want to say, because you have a lot of listeners out there, Adam, there's somebody out there that could write, like, I have long wanted this story to be told as a success story in the upper Midwest. Like, we really did do something great on both sides, and very few people would argue against it. So if someone out there is really good at telling stories and writing stories, I'd love to talk with you.
That's awesome. I hope someone takes the bait there.
That's right. Good job.
That's the best fish pun I can do. So, all right, Gwen, what comes to your mind for a success story for the Partners Program and other collaborations that you've seen? Winners for me,
I'm still getting landowners calling me from Illinois about their projects. So my landowners, and I'm notorious for bringing everybody to the table. Okay. So once I figure out what's needed and necessary, if I don't have the funding, I'll round up the folks who have those interests in funding, you're trying to get things on the ground, and sometimes I'm the only person that's at the table. And then once I start working on a project with the landowner, then all the other little people, well, I want to put some money in there too, so, you can start that chain reaction, because I'm not afraid to put habitat on the ground. And once it starts doing its stuff, we're working with, my big thing is trying not to get things listed. So we're working on some projects up in northern New Mexico, Rio Grande Cutthroat, and we're trying to do work, and that's Colorado and New Mexico. So I'm working with my counterpart in Colorado and coming on down here. So that's game and fish, state forestry, fisheries folks. I mean, it's the whole shoot match. Everybody is, they're getting on the bandwagon about, okay, if we can prevent it from being listing, let's go ahead and try this. And so, and our ranches over here, I mean, I was used to maybe 1,000 acres over, if I could find 1,000 acre one. They're bigger now because of corn production. But the ranch that we're working on is 587,000 acres. That's just one ranch. And then the connectivity from the big ranches up there coming down. And so we have the San Juan Cutthroat also, so which is going to be, I think she's going to be listed. But we didn't start putting this stuff together. We got the San Juan crew. So we're pulling, federal, BLM, Forest Service. We're all trying to work together on this. And like I said about partnering, it wasn't so much in New Mexico. I'm a partners person. So, I mean, I've been kind of cattle prodding people, and they're liking the idea of this. So a lot of more people are coming to the table, NGOs. I mean, landowners are out there, because they understand what's going on here. Our biggest conservation people are our landowners over here, which is very unusual to say. 53% of New Mexico is privately owned. Most people think it's all public land. It is not. So that's my palette, what I work on. And most of these landowners are really into this conservation thing because they realize it's good for their pocketbook. If we got good, healthy water, good, clean soil, grasses, whatever. So it's always been, basically, it boils back down to my landowner. And I also like to say, Adam, if you drill down deep enough in any initiative across the United States, you'll find a partners biologist.
So, Gwen, you made a comment that the vast majority of endangered species in this country are on private lands. Mm-hmm. And that was actually something we found that on the Fish and Wildlife Service website or something. And we talked about that in our first episode of this season as one of the, challenges and opportunities of habitat conservation on private lands. But I have a question, and maybe it's better for you, Kraig. about, given that reality, given that the majority of endangered species are on private lands, people sometimes get nervous about this. And we talked about it at the beginning, but I actually debated whether or not I'd bring this up because it's a little bit embarrassing about the place where I grew up. But I remember when I was a kid in the 90s in rural northern Indiana, people saying, if a bald eagle starts to build a nest on your land, you better go out there and cut the tree down because the feds will show up. And that would, of course, been a time where the bald eagle was still in the Endangered Species Act. And I just remember that. Of course, that wasn't my family, and I wasn't thinking that. I'm like saying that as self-preservation, but that's a sentiment that's out there, right? Is this perception that, unlike what we've been talking about with the Partners Program, like where Partners Program biologists only come on an invitation, there's this worry that like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to show up on your land and like assert eminent domain or something like that. Could you tell us more about like when or if that ever does happen and what people need to know about that? Yeah,
that's a great topic to sort of dive into. And I promise you, I drive a white van, not a black helicopter. Like that's what I drive every day is a white van. So, but all jokes aside, Adam, I mean, I think that fear, that anxiety that the Endangered Species Act or the presence of an endangered species is going to stop something. Like we got to get over that. Somehow we got to educate each other, both sides of that, to let people know the Endangered Species Act actually is the opposite. It's the opposite of stopping. There are authorizations within the act to allow the killing, the not intentional, but unintentional killing of endangered species if it's a byproduct of a project. All you have to do is that you showed you've considered it and you've thought about it, and that the loss of those individuals or whatever the unit you're evaluating wouldn't jeopardize the existence of the species. That's a pretty high mark, right? Think of the rusty patch bumblebee, for example. I mean, the more we've surveyed for the species across the upper Midwest, we now have a lot more high potential zones, a lot more nest and colony sites. So to think of a project that would jeopardize the existence of the species, not jeopardize the existence of the nest or a colony, but the species, that's a pretty high mark. And so I think people just need to recognize the act really allows for that disturbance, allows for that, what we call harassment or killing, as long as you've considered it and thought about it. And so that's the first thing I wanted to say is just, we need to educate people back and forth. On the flip side, however, there are people out there that, would use information in the wrong way. And because of the lack of information, or the lack of dialogue, people get all defensive or get a little bit weary about sharing location information. And once you get to that place where you're scared to share the information, but you have to share the information, we're just a lot of times we're just in a deadlock. And so that'd be my first plea to someone. Even if, call my office and just say, hey, hypothetically speaking, or a friend told me, and we can have this conversation in that way that would help someone. And then the other thing, just real quickly, I wanted to put on this because I think it's so important, is the term critical habitat. People hear this word, these two words, and they really have no idea what they mean. And so what critical habitat is, it's an official designation within the act. So if you have an endangered rusty patch, let's just go back to rusty patch bumblebee. If you have rusty patch bumblebee on your property, that's not critical habitat. It's habitat for the rusty patch bumblebee. Critical habitat is an area that is designated as critical for the existence of a species. This is very rare, really, right? So if you have, let's just make up this hypothetical situation. You have this species that can only live in groves of some type of tree. There's only one grove left on the planet. The rest have been cleared. It's the last grove. It's 50 acres. One could see then, well, if you lose these 50 acres, the species goes extinct. It is critical that we not lose these 50 acres of this particular grove of trees. That is not the case for the vast majority of our species. Do not have critical habitat because they are somewhat general in the way they can move around habitat complexes. So just because a species is present does not mean it is critical habitat. And I want to make sure people understand that. And I actually can't think, well, with the exception, no, I don't think I can think of anything in Illinois and Iowa off the top of my head that is critical habitat. There are some oxbows in the early days of the listing of the Topeka Shiner that got identified as critical habitat before we learned. But it really wasn't the oxbow, it was the biophysical properties of those areas. The only other thing that comes to mind is overwintering sites for Indiana bats. I don't think that they're actually listed as critical habitat per the act, but they're pretty darn important. Like down in Hannibal, Missouri, there's 100,000 overwintering Indiana bats, the largest concentration of endangered overwintering bats in the world. Kind of an important place. Kind of want to make sure we protect that one.
Right. And oftentimes those fall on already publicly managed land, or maybe that's a place where the Fish and Wildlife Service focuses with fee title acquisition, like buying
Absolutely.
the land. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. And willing sellers, I would add, Adam, like there is not a place that I can ever think of where somebody was like strong-armed into selling. Like that's not how this works. I mean, it's private land. Eminent domain doesn't exist in the endangered species world. Eminent domain really exists in pipelines, roadways, things where we're building infrastructure for the good of society. That's where eminent domain lives. It doesn't live in the Endangered Species Act. We don't have that authority in the Endangered Species Act.
That's really good to know. And I have to admit, I didn't know that going into the
don't. Most people don't. That's the thing. We've got to educate.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, wow. That really does actually resolve a lot of the questions that I had about endangered species and things. And I think it's...
I would just say too, Adam, I know I said some of that really passionately because that farm kid in me is coming out right now. Like I see people who, they work 2 jobs off the farm so they can have 160 acres. And on that 160 acres, they might have some cows or some goats or whatever. And they got some pond, they have some natural areas. And they want to maybe do something, but they're hearing all this information coming at them. They don't want to do it for rusty patch bumblebee or for Indiana bats because they're scared. Like, I want to make sure people that are listening to this know that's not how this works. It is not how this works.
That's really good to know. And I think it's a perfect segue into sort of starting to wrap up the episode and just sort of reiterate how the Partners program really is here to help people and to parse some of these sort of complex topics. On the show, we talk a lot about how wildlife habitat is species specific, and we emphasize that, and life space phase specific. And it gets really complicated when you say, I want to manage my property for wildlife habitat, say, that could mean cut the whole timber down or never touch the timber and everything in between, depending on what species you're choosing. And so one thing that I think Partners biologists provide and Fish and Wildlife Service biologists generally provide is some of that professional perspective on the strategy of wildlife habitat management, and helping landowners understand that what's good for the rusty patched bumblebee may be good for the American woodcock or maybe good for the wild turkey. And I think that's a really important takeaway. I think the last thing that I want to kind of explore that the Fish and Wildlife Service does a good job of out of absolute necessity, and that is looking at the landscape, looking beyond the property border and beyond the county or state or even regional borders, especially we think about these federal trust species that move long distances. We started the show talking about elk, but of course I think about ducks a lot, and both of those, when they move, are federal trust species. So could you tell us about how the Partners program or Fish and Wildlife Service generally sort of helps advance landscape level habitat conservation strategies on private and public lands?
Coming over to New Mexico, there's this, they call it the checkerboard, because what happens is you have state land offices will have a section in every section. You might have BLM or Forest Service, or you have some private land, so if I'm standing on somebody's property, if I could step forward, I could be on public, step backwards, I could be on state, So now I'm looking at this stuff and I'm going like, wait a minute. Now these critters are not paying any attention to any of these lines. All right. They're moving. All right.
Yeah.
So, and that's what that has been my vision since I've been here in New Mexico, is to let's not see those lines and let's all work together across these lines. And as long as you've got a private landowner involved, I'm going to be there. And so that's how we're addressing that in New Mexico. I have relationships with Arizona, Colorado, and Texas, my counterparts in those states. So we can go across these borders because we know these critters and these species move across these borders. A lot of our landowners own lands in 2 states. I'm getting ready to do a fire in northern Illinois, and it's going to start in New Mexico, but the landowner has property up in Colorado. And I've already talked with, my counterpart up there. We're going to burn straight across. Okay. So it can be done. Game and Fish is involved. Colorado, everybody's involved with this fire. So you're letting people know that you're doing this stuff. And everybody knows that's my vision in here. I don't see no lines. I just can't. I can't see them. And so everybody pretty much knows that if we're going to do this to make a landscape scale benefit, we've got to go landscape scale. All right. It's not going to be just your little parcel right there. If I'm fencing and I know I've got migration coming through your area, I'm going to do a different type of fence for here and then different type of fence for here so I can direct the traffic, whatever. So we do landscape scale because we know what's coming this way, whatever. But that's us doing our due diligence for these landowners. And so that's what it's about. So yeah, I'm a landscape scale person. I always have been. So Mr. McPeek can tell you that I go big.
So, she does go big. I think she may have misspoke, but I think she just told us she's going to have a fire from northern Illinois to New Mexico.
Okay. No, New Mexico and Colorado. So you caught me. Yeah.
Fire.
Messed up. Got too excited. I'm seeing you, so I see Illinois. So
I think everyone knows what you meant, but
thank you, Kraig.
I'll add to that the way Gwen articulated that so well with the migration and using different fences.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about landscape, particularly in this part of the world where we're at Illinois and Iowa, we have to build resiliency back into our landscapes. And what that means is every acre is not equal. And we have some of the most productive soil on the planet. And it should be used, in my opinion, to grow food and fiber because it is the most productive on the planet. We have other areas that aren't. And so, this is just Kraig talking, but we need to think about and re-envision our programs in a way that are strategically opportunistic, where they're targeting areas that make the most sense, where we want to rebuild riparian areas. Not every riparian area is equal. Some have greater benefit for nitrogen reduction, soil retention, and migratory bird corridors. We should be targeting resources into these areas, knowing we're making a conscious decision to design a landscape that we won't benefit from for 10, 20, 30 years. And we need visionary people in this profession to be thinking not just about the duck, but the landscape and building resiliency back so they can rebound.
I concur.
I do too. It's a perfect. I'm going to push you though a second. Could you give us examples of how the Fish and Wildlife Service is approaching or leading on that approach?
Absolutely. I could tell you a couple of things. One, when I tell you our focus and our philosophy here is about recovery, we don't perhaps prioritize some of the regulatory workload as much as doing more delivery of conservation with our partners, with private landowners for recovery of endangered species. That's a shift, right? And those are the kinds of things that cultural shifts. But more specifically, I would talk about things like WRP and the USDA programs. Like we should be targeting large, they can implement, when I say they and we, they're interchangeable. I'm talking about the greater conservation community. We could be implementing and delivering conservation into our landscapes in a way where we're targeting watersheds that we know will have immediate returns versus other watersheds that maybe they wouldn't. So yeah, that's what I would just say is that, I think to quote a friend of mine from years ago who said, this was about 10 years ago, the agricultural systems that we see today in Iowa, they're not going to last forever. They can't. They're not sustainable based on the way the inputs are used. And he said to me, our job is not to tell people how to farm. Our job is to build a bridge to let technology, let science catch up to that. And I would say the same about conservation. Our job is not to tell everybody where to do it and how to do it. It's to build the bridge to let the next generation build onto it, to get us to that place where we have resilient landscapes again. And we can't do it without private landowners, period.
I love that analogy and that example. And it takes me back, Gwen, to that ranch that I'm trying to picture, the sign at the gate that said, what was the endangered species that they renamed the ranch for?
New Mexico Meadow Jumping Mouse Ranch.
I absolutely love that. And I think that level of connection and that level of enthusiasm is the dream. And to your point, Kraig, that some of these, we can start easy. We can start with, okay, you've got an issue with erosion on the stream bank. We're going to help you do that.
Yep.
And then we're going to build from there. And all of a sudden we're going to be renaming farms and ranches to endangered species. That's what we're
Topeka Shiner Ranch. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I can think of some farms here in Iowa even that have done that. So that's an awesome story. Yeah. Well, we're running short on time. And I think the last thing I want to ask is just sort of a nuts and bolts question. You've certainly sold me on the Partners Program, Gwen. And if one of our listeners is listening in any state in the country, how could they learn more about the Partners Program? How could they find your equivalent in their state? And what would that interaction look like? They pick up the phone and they say, I want to learn about your programs. What would happen next?
Well, if you call me, I'm going to find out what you got in mind, so I can see if we can work together and stuff like that. And like I tell them, hey, you can tell a doctor all your symptoms over the phone, but you won't get no diagnosis until we see it, right? Until I see you in person. And so then we go on out there and we walk, and I've been known to walk 100 acres, 1,000 acres. I don't care. I'm walking the edges. And that's how we get it started, because again, it's voluntary. They call us and then we just go and see what they envision for their lands. To find all of us, you need to go to fws.gov partners. Yeah, if you get into the fws.gov website, go on the left-hand column, go on down to Partners with Fish and Wildlife, and that will give you access to the rest of us across the United States. Or you can just call me and I can, because I've been in airports, I've been all over the United States, and I'll send people to the state coordinator in that state. Just call me and I'll get their number for you. But that's the best way to do it, because I've got a lot of people calling me now. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we'll definitely link to that in the show notes. And the way that we do, I'm going to try to find some resources on Topeka Shiners and Rio Grande and San Juan cutthroat too, and some of these other species we've been talking about. We always try to make sure to include resources for folks. Anything else that you two want to say and sort of wrapping up the episode here? Anything that we didn't touch on, or closing comments you'd have for the listeners?
I just want to say one thing. Health is wealth, and these private landowners are going to be the ones that carry us into the future. So as much as we can, whatever we can, we need to be working with these private landowners to get that stuff met, because you'd be surprised. People think they don't care. I beg to differ. They care probably more than some of us, and we're getting paid to have this fun. Okay. That's my closing statement.
Yeah, I can't top that. Don't give up. I would just say to landowners, don't give up on your dreams. Don't give up on your visions, and don't think people aren't listening, right? If a program has helped you, call your your elected officials, let them know how meaningful it has been so that they can support those programs and those initiatives. So don't think people aren't listening.
Thank you both very much for your time and coming on the podcast and sharing your perspectives and breaking down some of these questions that we had about the really important work that the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing on behalf of everybody in the United States to steward these resources. So really appreciate your energy and work in this sphere. So, and to the listeners, thanks for tuning in. As always, there's a short survey in the end of the show, or in the show notes here. You can give us feedback and tell us what you'd like to learn more about. And as always, like us and subscribe to the show. and tell your friends about it.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.